Science journalism plays a huge role in bridging the gap between science and society. To tell us a little bit more about the challenges and opportunities faced by science journalists, we're here at MIT to chat with the director of the Knight Science Journalism Programme, Deborah Blum. Deborah, thank you so much for joining us today. I wonder, can you kick us off by giving me a bit of a background about you, the work that you do, and what you're excited about at the moment?
I'm always excited about something. So I've been a science journalist since the 1980s, so a long time, and I'm the daughter of a scientist, which is probably one of the reasons I got into it. Um, but I got into it. I had been a journalist for about 5 years, and I thought I love I love journalism. I love the puzzle of when someone tells you they won't give you information. You get to work around the no. I think that really appeals to my personality, right? Which probably means I'm a difficult person to live with. But I really like figuring out how things work. And I really like getting around a refusal to talk. And so all of that, I think, made me interested in journalism. But then I thought, I want to write about something I care about. So I got a grad degree, and in the 1980s, this was not that common, but I got a grad degree in environmental journalism with an emphasis on toxicology and history of science, which obviously really shaped what I did later. And I moved to California and was a science writer there. It was a wonderful job, and did all kinds of investigations, including a very long one into ethical issues in primate research, which won me the Pulitzer. This is like skipping a stone across the lake of my career, right? Did my first book, then became a professor of practice at the University of Wisconsin, wrote more books. I think when I went to the University of Wisconsin, I was really worried about not being a journalist. It's almost like being a journalist is an essential part of who I am. And when I went to work at a university, I was like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't want to be an academic in the classic sense. I need to be a journalist. So I said yes to every freelance job. I freelance for Good Housekeeping, and I freelance for Mother Jones, and I freelance for Time, and I freelanced for just about anyone who asked me. Hallmark Cards magazine, even, right? If
Wow.
people asked me, I would freelance. And worked on books, and then MIT recruited me to come here. And so I'll be starting on my 10th year at MIT in the next year, which is also kind of crazy. So, and I'll just say briefly about this job, right? Science journalism is really important. And the Knight Science Journalism Program is the leading science journalism program in the world. I mean, that's an easy thing to say because there aren't that many science journalism science journalism fellowship program. So we're the leading science journalism fellowship program in the world. And so when I came here, I saw that as a platform to do good, right? We're an influential platform. We bring in all kinds of amazing journalists through this program, but we also have a voice in science journalism and why it matters and what's important. So since I've come here, we started publishing a magazine on Dark, which is about the push and pull between science and society, which I think is a really important part of what we do as journalists. And we've done a lot of training programs that are way beyond what our fellowship is. So if you went to our website, there is a free downloadable handbook for people who edit science, because everyone trains the writer. No one ever trains the editor, and yet editors are really gatekeepers of science information. So you'll find that in English, French, Portuguese, simplified and traditional Chinese, I don't think it's in Spanish, and Farsi. And it's in Farsi because I'm friends with an exiled Iranian journalist in Canada, and he wanted it to be able to teach science journalism in Iran.
Wow.
And so you can go to our website and download that handbook in all of those different languages as a kind of free textbook of science journalism. And that is really exciting to me.
It's so impactful. We were chatting just now in the kitchen about the Knight Science Journalism Programme, and the amazing people that have come through this and the ripple effect they continue to have, not just in the work that they do, but in how they kind of pay that forward as well with their cohorts. And I think that is a really special thing to be a part of, to be as influential in science journalism as you've been, as this program is, must be incredible. Can you tell us, maybe, this is going to be so hard, what is the thing that you're proudest of having seen come out of this program?
Oh, the people, right. I mean, so the Night Science Journalism program is just over 40 years old. I'm the fourth director, the first female director, but I'm the fourth director. And so it's trained or given a home or helped further educate hundreds of journalists since that time period. And if you really look at who they are, they come from all over the world. We have this year a reporter from Science who's based in Germany, and an editor for Nature who's based in Australia, and a reporter from Technology Review who's based in London, and an investigative reporter from Nigeria. So it's an international program. And we hope that these guys come, they do research in areas they care about. For instance, our fellow from Science covered COVID, and he has spent the year looking at how to combat misinformation. So we give them a chance to really do a deep dive on an issue that matters to them, but also to just explore at MIT and Harvard and figure out ways that they can do their job better. And they go back and they share that, right? They share it with other journalists. Some of them go back and actually start training programs in their home countries. So I hope we have that kind of ripple effect. And I hope we're saying to people, because this really matters to me, science journalism is one of the most important aspects of journalism as a profession. What we do is absolutely essential in modern society. In this sense, science and technology are probably the most powerful transformative forces on the planet today, right? And if you look at the impacts of science and technology, from the internet to climate change, I'm talking about less positive ones, to our understanding of evolution, to the very important and necessary development of vaccines, right? Science transforms life. It makes us safer and puts us at risk. And so if science journalists can tell that story right and give people, I always think of it as we give people a toolkit to navigate this world that's being transformed around them, there's nothing more important.
Absolutely. I was going to pick up a little bit on that, actually, because science journalism is often seen as being quite a sort of separate discipline. It falls under more of the arts and humanities, the creative side of things, rather than within scientific research. But the challenge is that it really does play such an integral part in public engagement with research. Are we doing enough to help people understand the role that science journalism plays? Are we doing enough to encourage scientists to explore that avenue of public engagement?
That's a really good question. So my dad came from a generation of scientists who believed that real scientists do not communicate with the public, right? They publish in their specialized journal and they talk to each other. And if they actually talked to a civilian, right, but someone outside the community of science, then they were considered popularizers who had sold out their profession and were just beating their own drums. And so they wouldn't do it. And when I became a science journalist, the first thing my father said to me is, well, don't interview my friends, because he was just horrified that his daughter was going into the dreaded profession of science journalism. That has changed somewhat. But one of the things I've always thought is, because for many years scientists were taught that they degraded themselves by communicating with the public, and even worse, and I absolutely hate this phrase, they would go, well, I couldn't possibly dumb down my work, right? Which always, as a science journalist, makes me want to smack someone, right? there was a vacuum. This is what I think. The community, the world of science journalism grew in a vacuum created by scientists who wouldn't communicate it with the public. Somebody needs to share the story of science with the public. And I don't mean that because the public pays for science. You hear this all the time. Well, the public deserves to know because they're paying the bills. Not entirely. And that's not really why it matters. It matters because if we don't build a science literate society, if people don't understand science and how it works and how it works in their everyday life, then they cannot make informed decisions. They can't influence policy in ways that it needs to be influenced. They can't even protect themselves adequately from some of these effects, right? So we need that information to be out there. We need a science literate community. Have we successfully persuaded scientists that science journalism is a wonderful thing? Absolutely, we have not, right? And when I talk to scientists, almost the first thing they'll say, and I've often been the token science communicator on committees of like the National Academy and stuff, and literally the scientists on those committees will see it as, here's my chance to tell a science journalist what's wrong with her, right? And so the first thing that happens is everyone wants to tell you about a journalist who got something wrong, or, right, they focus on the negative aspects of this. And part of that is probably that, as a scientist, you're taught to be precise about every detail. And as a journalist, often you're turning out a complicated story in less than 24 hours, and you're going for the big picture concepts, and sometimes we don't get all the details right, right? And having been a book author and having been interviewed quite a bit, what I usually say to scientists, I don't think that I always make that much of a difference, is why don't you focus on the information, getting the information that matters right? Not everything has to be right. The fact that the journalist said you were wearing a brown shirt when it was gray, who cares? Right? Get a grip on that, right? The fact that you didn't like the way they described your hair, get over it, right? Think about the message that you're trying to get out to the public, and think about the fact that we need to be in this together and getting this information out to the public, right? And quit worrying because, they didn't do your eyelashes justice or whatever. And you do have scientists get into the weeds just that much, right? Not that we don't make mistakes, but here's the other part of it. Scientists make mistakes, right? And one of the big tensions between science and science journalism, there's many, but one of them is that we want to portray science as what it is, which is a human enterprise. And if it's a human enterprise, then there's human mistakes, and there's human ego, and there's missteps, and there's also the fact that knowledge is evolving. So what we think, the COVID-19 pandemic was a great example of that. What we thought about that virus and how it was transmitted at the start of the pandemic evolved, right? So we no longer washed our vegetables and hysterically sprayed everything with Lysol, right? Because that turned out to be not nearly as important in terms of transmission. And one of the things I think that we and scientists could do better together is to help people understand that science is a process, right? That knowledge evolves. And the fact that knowledge evolves does not mean that science is wrong. It means that it's a human enterprise, and scientists are people trying to figure out the world around us. And they're going to get it right, and they're going to get it wrong, and they're going to learn from their mistakes. And we all need to accept that that's part of the process. And we all need to do a better job of telling that story.
As you were talking about how scientists can be so critical of journalists getting some of these, insignificant details wrong some of the time, that's exactly what I kept thinking, that science is this sort of iterative process of failure until we get things a little bit better. Science is probably, and research is maybe the only profession where it's quite exciting when somebody goes, oh, actually, that's all wrong, because it breaks open this whole new area of research. And yet there is that criticism of science journalism, which I just find really quite surprising and shocking even to this day. I wonder, do you think that the way that we train researchers feeds into that culture? Because I reflect on when I was an academic, and we're told that there are these three very important pillars of being part of this community. There's research, and there's teaching, and there's engagement. But really, when it came down to it, the success criteria that we're measured upon is research and publications and the money we get in.
Right.
Teaching is often an afterthought, which is awful, and it does our students a real injustice.
Agreed.
But the engagement didn't even feature on appraisals, on promotions, on workload models. Yet there was the expectation. I remember it was Sir Mark Walport, who's the old chief scientific officer in the UK, and he said science isn't finished until it's communicated. And I think that's so true. And yet we don't seem to add value to that. But it is such a valuable thing. What would you like to see change in research culture to help people better understand the value?
I mean, that's such a smart point. So, you know, it tends to be in science that you have, as you say, research and publication, and that's what advances your career. And then there's a nod to outreach or public engagement, and that doesn't advance your career at all, right? And I've actually talked to people who are in the process of going for tenure who are doing really amazing work, and I've said, you should do this publicly, and they're, oh no, that would interfere with me getting tenure. My advisor told me not to communicate that with the public because that would get in the way. So one of the things I think that has to happen is that the institutions of science start saying, if you are able to communicate well, if you share your information with the public, that's actually going to help advance your career in public. It's not this tacked on duty that you have to do, you know, that is just a waste of your time. It's actually part of what being a scientist is. So that has to be integrated into the way we teach science. And then the institutions themselves need to learn to actually actively reward that. I'm on the advisory committee of an award that the National Academy here in the U.S. administers, which is the, I'm going to take a minute to make sure I get this right. It's the Schmidt Communication Award, and it's funded by Schmidt Futures. And it's a communications award both for scientists and for journalists. And it is a $40,000 award, which is a lot for any kind of communication award. And it goes to graduate students and postdocs, it goes to early career scientists, and it goes to mid-career scientists. And it actively rewards them, and it is given at the National Academy and considered something that you can go back to your tenure committee or your department chair and say, look, I'm getting this national recognition. We need more of that. We need universities to do more of that. And we need universities, I think, to spend more time integrating this just into the everyday instruction of scientists, right? Because the fact of the matter is, you know, I am a science journalist. I love science journalism, but we're a tiny proportion of journalism, right? In the United States, there are maybe 10,000 journalists who are in the National Association of Science Writers, the Society of Environmental Journalists, and the American Healthcare Journalists Association. We in the United States love to form these associations, right? But 10,000 reporters in a country of over 350 million is not very many. And so if we don't have scientists also communicating, that's like asking the story of science to go through the eye of a needle, right? And so we actually need scientists to also tell the story of science and to engage with the public. And I can also tell you why I think just scientists engaging with the public is important. So I'll briefly say, I was on a communications committee of the National Academy, and they asked people, just did this random survey, when was the last time you talked to a scientist? And almost everyone in that survey said, well, you know, I met with my dentist, or I had to go see my doctor, but they don't actually talk to scientists. Scientists become this alien species to them. And we mistrust what's alien, and we mistrust what we don't know. So when scientists segregate themselves away from the public, right, then this public sees them as the other, and they tend to see them, and I hear this when I go out and talk to people, they tend to see scientists as people who think they're smarter than I am.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody wants to be lectured by someone who thinks they're smarter than they are, right? And so you start building some public hostility towards science into the mix. We actually, the more people can see scientists as actual human beings next door, right, the better off we all are. That's true for journalism too. Mm-hmm. I mean, people also see journalists as the other and mistrust them, right? And then really briefly going back to that question of accuracy, I'm always mocking science. We do need to get it right. One of the things we also do here as KSJ is spearhead of programs in fact-checking our stories. Mm-hmm. It's like, get it right going up. You mm-hmm. want to be trusted? Get it right, right? And so we, and certainly this is true at Undark, put all of our writers through a grueling fact check, mm-hmm. right? And when I've written for Undark, I found the fact check incredibly painful. Right? They questioned everything I say, right? It's so annoying. But then when the story comes out, there's no corrections because everything is solid going out the door. And we do want that in journalism. Mm. We do want to, I don't want to just be flippant about mm-hmm. this. I mm-hmm. do want scientists to chill mm-hmm. about, very small errors because we chill about a lot of their errors. But I also want to say that it's important for journalists to get it right.
Yeah. You spoke about, you briefly mentioned misinformation, and you also spoke about science literacy. Mm-hmm. Science literacy and science capital are hugely important, as you said, in terms of things like civic engagement, for example, in helping people have the confidence to feel that they can make the right decisions when it comes to using their democratic right to choose how they want to see the society that they live in. We're 65 years on from C.P. Snow's Two Cultures lecture, somehow, 65 years already. Wow. And increasingly, we can see that people will never feel afraid to say, oh, I don't, they'll never say, I don't like music just because they're not a musician. Right. Yet, we have this culture where people say, oh, I never liked science in school. I have no interest in it. I have no engagement in it. Given that there is so much information out there now, and science journalism is under threat from a huge amount of misinformation and disinformation from, deliberately from bad actors, what can we do as a community of scientists and science journalists to help people better understand what information out there is credible, right, and trustworthy?
Well, I sometimes say to people or try to remind people that science journalism is not post-secondary education. So all of us in every society need to think about how we educate people about science. And I once had a conversation about this with a science historian at Caltech, the California Institute of Technology. And he said American K-12 in the United States from kindergarten through 12th grade before you go to university. Science education is a filtration system for the priesthood in which you get educated in science. And as you move up into what we call middle school and high school, if you're not destined to be a scientist, the system of education throws you out. You're not required to take science all the way through high school. You're not smart enough to take science all the way through high school. The message from the high school is you're not smart enough to do this. And so people just bail out of the system and they tell themselves in the way we are going to tell themselves, well, that's not important to me. That doesn't matter. That's not part of my everyday life. And so we need to do a better job, I think, starting beyond what we do as journalists. We need to do a better job of teaching science to the non-science futures people, to people who are never going to be scientists. And one of my favorite examples of this actually from my own, I've got two sons, my own son's education. So I have two sons. One of them was a total science head, right? Instead of taking regular physics and science, he took math physics and spent a lot of time his senior year calculating the trajectory of rockets, right? I'm just like, to me, I'm going, seriously, is this my child? My other son, just couldn't stand it. And he ended up in a class it was a forensic science class in the high school in which they took one room in the high school and made it an evolving crime scene. And
Wow.
so the students studied blood analysis and genetics and crime and fingerprinting and toxicology and all of these different aspects of science that were relevant to their everyday life. I think we need to do more of that. Not everyone, we don't want everyone to be a scientist, but we do want everyone to know something about science and how to make decisions about science and to recognize that every time you fry an egg or make a cup of tea or peel a banana, you're engaging with chemistry, right, and everyday science, and it makes the world that much more interesting. So that's my usual platform speech about the fact that we just need to do a better job with education. What happens is people come out and they go into the world, they've become hostile to science, and they're continually being told by representatives of science that they need to do things that they don't want to do, right? They need to cut back on their use of fossil fuels. They need to get painful shots. They need to, do all of these activities. Go to the dentist, in fact, or there's huge debates about fluoridation, which, right? They need to do all these things that they don't trust, and they have come out of their education system thinking, well, science doesn't matter to me, so why should these people tell me? And we see this increasingly reflected now for a couple of reasons. If you look at, in the United States, the studies that the Pew Research Foundation does, in which they survey the general public, you see declining trust in science. It's still high compared to journalism, right, which is always at the bottom of everyone's list. I think in the Edelman Trust Barometer, journalists are just above politicians usually, right, which is really annoying. But you see science, trust in institutions falling, and you see trust in science falling. So why is that? Some of it is what I'm talking about. We are raising generations of people who come out of their education thinking science doesn't matter in their everyday life, and they don't trust science. That we're seeing these confrontational situations with science, and in the information ecosystem we live in today, which is the internet ecosystem, we're seeing information fragmented so that each of us lives, people will use the word silo, or they'll use the word bubble, or they'll use the word echo chamber, but everyone in the internet age cherry picks their sources of information and will tend to pick sources of information that reinforce our own beliefs and support the way we see the world. It's interesting because as a journalist, what you're taught is that truth, you're taught from the beginning, if you're any good at being a journalist, that truth is a multifaceted thing. And when you're covering science, you're taught to never just take the word of the principal investigator or PI that this is the greatest study ever done. You have to fact check that. You have to talk to other sources of information. You have to do enough research that you can figure out where the weight of the evidence lies. That's the principle of good science journalism, right? But in general, in society, we're not taught that. Where does the weight of the evidence lie? And should I trust just one angle, one political angle, one source of information? Of course, I should not, because I should look at many angles of information, think of truth as a gemstone, it's multifaceted, and put it together to arrive at what I think where the weight of the evidence lies. We don't teach people to do that. They're happy in their own little community of information, and sometimes, frankly, that community of information is wrong. Right? And so a lot of times, I'm stepping out of science for a minute when I'm looking at some of the political beliefs in the United States. I have to say to myself, well, those people aren't seeing what I'm seeing. Those people are only getting that information from one source. And I force myself to go out of my bubble and look at what other people are seeing so I can try to understand them. But that's a journalistic behavior. Most people don't do that, and so they're vacuum sealed into an information source. And if part of your vacuum sealed information source are what I'm going to call bad actors, people who are giving you misinformation because it suits their financial ends, it suits their political ends, it suits their need to be famous, right? It suits their, whatever reason that advances them and their agenda. If you're not fact checking that against other sources of information, you're incredibly vulnerable to bad information. And we really do live in that world right now, where one of the challenges, I think, for all journalists, not just science journalists, is how do I get through, across that wall, penetrate that bubble, make people listen to this information in a way that they're clearly going to be resistant to. It's in the same way that I like the no that brought me into journalism. You can't do that. I find that particularly important because I like to think a lot of how do we get over that wall, through that bubble, reach that audience. And that's one of the things that I think is both important and fascinating and daunting and frustrating in science journalism today.
Yeah. It is a real challenge to be a science journalist, to read some of the information that is published out there that clearly is not telling the full story, or clearly has been written through quite a biased lens. But I suppose trying to engage with people who have very different beliefs is quite difficult, because as you start to challenge those beliefs, you're almost challenging the core of them and the culture they've grown up in and everything. But it is an incredible position to be in, because science journalism really is such a mirror to integrity of what's being reported. You are in a position as a science journalist to really critically look at research that's going on across a whole field, connect that with social science and society, and really actually start to unpick some of those biases people may not even realize that they've picked up on. There comes a risk with that, though, doesn't there?
There does.
How do we encourage more people to get involved in communicating science and in reporting research that may not be as trustworthy as we would hope it would be? How do we minimize the risk for people?
That's such an interesting question. I mean, one of the things that we have been having a conversation in science journalism today, it deals with what you're talking about, which is that, going back, science is a human enterprise. There are errors, right? There are errors of gradual understanding, right, in which scientists are just figuring things out. So your first understanding is wrong, but you correct that. The wonders of replication, as you say, where you keep replicating until you're like, okay, this is actually validated. But because it's a human enterprise, there is sometimes fraud. There is sometimes an overemphasis on an early finding. And you'll hear among the criticisms that scientists will bring against science journalists that we are part of eroding trust in the profession. We report on these errors. We report on fraudulent research. We make the research community look less trustworthy to the rest of the world. Why don't we pack it up and go home and go back to the good old days when we just reported on science as if every golden word was to be trusted, right? Obviously, we can't do that, and that would be a mistake. But it makes it a really interesting challenge in science journalism today, because you're aware, right, that these are perilous information times. So, a good example of that was, you probably saw that the president of Stanford University had to step down, and that some of the errors, uncorrected errors in his research, are actually reported by the student newspaper. Actually by a student journalist who was the son of a New York Times journalist, so came from a kind of pedigree of, serious journalism. To me, in the same way that in science we say, we couldn't replicate that result, we need to go back and look at the original finding. We need to make it better. We actually serve the institution of science by doing that, right? When we go out and we say, we need to hold science to a level of integrity.
Mhm.
We need to hold ourselves to that level of integrity at the same time. Let's be honest, right? I think we serve the community of science, right? We're part of the ecosystem that helps make science smarter and better. And the more we're transparent and the more science is transparent about how it works and how it corrects errors, I believe we all become more trustworthy. There's risk to us in that sometimes scientists don't trust us because of that, or they're afraid of us. And there's risks to us in doing this. And I've certainly run into this in which you're reporting on science, and the people who read or listen to or watch what you say will say, well, why should I trust that scientist why would I think that scientist is a trustworthy source? So again, it's on us as science journalists to give the full context and to do our homework, right? So a lot of times when I'm researching a story, and I'm really interested, I write about toxicology primarily now, right? So if I'm going to write about something and I'm going to say it's a risk, then just to give you a transparent example of how I'm going to do that, I might see a scientific paper that suggests that something is a risk. I'm never going to accept that scientific paper at face value. One of the things I'm going to do is research the scientists in advance. There's a website called Retraction Watch that archives bad actor scientists. I might, if I don't know the scientist at all, put that name through Retraction Watch just to make sure that this person has a credible history, right? That won't be in my story. That's me validating it. Then I will usually run that scientist, before I do a single interview, I'll look at that scientist's publication history in either Google Scholar or PubMed. What have they published? Is this an area that they actually know anything about? Have they been cited in this area? How long have they been studying it? Can I validate for myself that this scientist themselves is a trustworthy source, right? So I'll do that. Then I will not ask the scientist who I should talk to about their work. I go into their papers, I look at other people who are in the field, I tag those other people. This would be typical for me when I was writing about a risk. I used to write a column called Poison Pen for the New York Times about different risks, and this was my actual operating method, right? I'd look at a risk, then I'd check the scientists, then I'd look at what else we knew about the risk, then I'd look at where the weight of the evidence lies. So, for instance, with BPA, which used to be in a lot of plastics and is mostly out, it was pretty clear that that was mostly a risk to women, right? It affects the female reproductive system. So, and the other thing I do when I'm writing about a chemical exposure is I say, what's the mechanism of the damage, right? People will come up and they'll go, well, so and such is dangerous. I go, really? How does that work, right? So with BPA, it was pretty clear that you could actually get at the mechanism of how that affected female reproductive cells. And so I won't actually write about something that's a risk until I have satisfied myself that you can actually, that it's not an association, right? I mean, the famous saying that association is not causation, right? So I'll go into that. I'll look at the sample size, right? How many people actually showed this, right? How many people were in the actual risk study? And just to give you one other, as I go on and on, one other example of this. I did a story for Undark on the risk of soy formula. So a lot of people, sometimes it's like a belief that they shouldn't be feeding their children cow's milk. Sometimes there are children who are allergic to compounds in cow's milk. They're lactose intolerant. They'll give their kids soy formula. Soy formula is full of phytoestrogens, right? It has about 11,000 as many estrogens in it as cow's milk does. It's like super rich with these estrogens. Wow. And so there's a whole body of study that shows that when you are eating or drinking soy products, you're bombarding your system with estrogens. Is if you're an adult and your system is already fully formed, no big deal, right? But if you're a developing child and you're bombarding the system with estrogens, what does that mean? And so there is a whole body of research that shows the mechanism in which those phytoestrogens can alter some of the female reproductive cells in young girls. And there's research linking it to, earlier menstruation and some other things, right? So I was taking a look at that, and I wouldn't write that until I had gone all the way through the mechanism. And then I had looked at, let's put this in context, what kind of a risk this actually is. And then the last thing I want to say, I'm using this as an example of something about journalism in the internet age. So we published that story. That story basically said, here's a very contained risk. There's a chance in a small number of children that you can alter the development of the reproductive system at a cellular level. People read that story, and I was bombarded with parents who were like, oh my God, I gave my child soy formula. That's why they're gay, right? I mean, just completely reading it and bringing their own fears into it. And this is one of the other things when you're writing about risks, is that you have to know that you can clearly spell things out, but that people, because they have their own fears or beliefs or concerns, will look at what you've written and it'll feed into their belief system. So one of the things I was able to do in the comments, I spent hours in the comments answering people. Wow. And this is a really great thing that we can do in journalism today, right? Everyone hates the comments section because sometimes it can get really abusive, but you can actually go and respond to people. You can turn it from a unidirectional information into a conversation. And I think it's in the conversational nature of the internet that sometimes we do our best work, right? It's not just me talking to you, it's you and I talking together. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. You're going from dissemination to true engagement.
Yes.
And I think it's a real privilege to be able to have a platform now where we're able to do that, where we can break down the barriers, as you were saying, between the public and scientists, but the public and science journalists as well.
And scientists as well can do this. And the thing about it is then you actually are engaging. You're not just talking from, coming down the mountain with your stone tablets of information. You're actually talking, and you're bringing people into the community together. And I think in the same way I, was saying we need to think about how we define a scientist. That's part of the job of the scientist is as communicator. We also need to think about how the role of the journalist changes in this age. And part of what we do is have these conversations. We do engage, right? There's organizations like ProPublica here in the US that actually have hired what they call engagement editors to make sure that we have these conversations, that we respect the community and continue to engage with them even after the story happens. And I think today that matters more than ever.
Yeah. You gave us amazing examples of the mechanism that you use to try and determine whether something is trustworthy or not. I think there are such practical steps that can actually be adopted by researchers as well, who are building on their own work and really kind of have these markers of trust almost that they look for. I think you really managed to address a lot of the challenges that we're facing. I want to skip right back to the very beginning for my final question. You said that everything excites you, and I love that.
It's true.
Do you think you can pin down the thing that you're most excited about, whether it is a challenge that you're excited to take on, the opportunity to overcome, or whether it's changes coming through science journalism? What is exciting you about the next 5 or 10 years of science journalism?
Oh, that's such a good question. So I always say to myself, I want the next generation of science journalists to be smarter than mine, right? I mean, the sort of whole professionalization of science journalism is part of my early career. When I first started, there were not programs in science journalism. Now there are, right? Now we see scientists who become science journalists. That's a major step forward for us. I want this next generation of science journalists to be less awestruck by science, right? To see it as the human enterprise it is, to situate science in the real world, right? So it's not just that we're telling the story of, I'm going to air quote this, discovery and breakthrough, but we are telling the story of science as it weaves through our everyday lives with all its social justice implications, because that's really important. Science has is the benefits of science are often unequally distributed around the world, right? And the negative impacts of science technology the same. So if you look at the way we cover environmental issues, it's quite often poor communities that bear the brunt of some of this, right? We need to write about science and its impacts, right? We need to acknowledge that it has these social and cultural impacts. We need to illuminate those in all of their social justice issues. That's, I think, where I would like to see our profession go. And I think that's what I'm really excited about, right? The idea that we're going to become more thoughtful, richer storytellers in sharing the story of science with the world in this gemstone, multifaceted way that I think is reality.
And I'm excited to see how you and the Knight Science Journalism Programme tackle that. I'm so excited to be able to share this conversation with our community. Deborah, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with me today.
It was absolutely a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for being here.